Parks and Rec is a show that has a lot of weird characters and a lot of weird plot lines, and because of that, there tends to be a lot of weird and sometimes off-the-wall theories. Some of them grow and develop within the actual show. Some of them are simply hinted at here and there, and some of them aren't actually mentioned at all. But the fun and absolute insanity that we see Parks and Rec sometimes devolve into is what makes it possible for many, if not all of these things, to be true in some way or another. And what better way to look at a couple of the stranger theories that revolve around the series than by doing an Iceberg video. This is far from the first Iceberg video I've done on the channel, so here's a super quick rundown. I'm going to go through each point from top to bottom and discuss each of them. The top are more well-known theories or facts, and as you go further down into the dark unknown, things start to get a bit weirder and sometimes more abstract. And as always, there might be spoilers ahead, but the show's been over for like 10 years, so it's hard to spoil a show like that. So yeah, be warned of that, I guess. And hey, while we're here, comment down below your favorite Parks and Rec theory. Back to the video. Ron Swanson is nothing if not incredibly secretive about anything to do with his personal life. We've seen on multiple occasions the lengths he'll go to keep his incredible wealth hidden not just from both of the Tammys, but anyone who he might view as not worthy. At one point in the series, we see Ron reworking his will so that upon his eventual death, if Ron Swanson can die that is, his family will be well taken care of. Because of this, we do actually see Ron's previous will, which was just a quick note that he carried with him that said, quote, "Upon my death, all of my belongings shall transfer to the man or animal who killed me," along with a few weird random symbols. Or I guess I should say seemingly random symbols, because someone on Reddit thinks they cracked the code and thinks these symbols are actually a very detailed map that leads to where Ron has hidden his fortune. Let's go through it. First off, we know that Pawnee is located in southeastern Indiana. The first symbol indicates to rotate the map about 40 degrees to the right. Cardinal north is now pointing to the northeast. The loop on the right now reveals itself as Cane Branch, the northeastern arm of the Patoka Lake in Hoosier National Forest. There is a marker of some sort between two arms of Cane Branch. The author of this theory thinks that the marker is likely a hubcap or something nailed to a tree. Something that would be easy to signify, but would also be easy to overlook as something used for something like target practice. The hubcap would likely have a name etched onto it, probably on the back. That'll be important soon. From there, you'd head southwest to find an old pioneer graveyard. Find the grave with the corresponding name from the hubcap. That's where Ron Swanson hid his fortune. But to take this even a step further, the note may also have detailed directions on where Ron Swanson wants his remains left, assuming that whatever killed him was honorable enough to properly take care of Ron's remains. So this symbol seems to have the letters for Ohio hidden within it. The two I's are O's, the cross forms the left side of an H, and the I's form the right half. And that little squiggly line beside it seems to indicate this as the Ohio River. The map shows what seems to be an island in the river, an island known as Dead Man's Island. It doesn't look like this on Google Maps anymore, but apparently at one point, right where the mark was on the map, there was a glint of something there. So this seems to indicate where exactly Ron wanted to be buried. And as for the weird symbol on the right, well, it seems you can make out some letters from the symbol as well. RIP RVS. Rest in peace, Ron Ulysses Swanson. So at first glance, or second glance, or after many, many glances, it's pretty easy to come to the assumption that Andy Dwyer is a complete buffoon. But if we take a step back and look at the entirety of the series, a lot of Andy's actions can be viewed as not just smart, but verging on genius. I mean, we're talking about a guy who went from homeless to a job that had him traveling around the world. And aside from that, we've heard that Andy got a 1500 on his SATs. I mean, that puts him at like the 99th percentile for SAT takers, and could realistically get him into just about any university he'd want to, if his grades were good and extracurriculars were in order, which, knowing Andy, they probably weren't. But that's also not the only test we've seen Andy do well on. He also got a perfect score on the written police exam. He's obviously either an incredibly lucky test taker or a smart guy when he wants or needs to be. But that also doesn't take into account any of the other endeavors we've seen from him. He's a very accomplished musician, having played to large crowds and even played with local music legend Duke Silver. Not to mention he single-handedly wrote, directed, produced, and starred in a TV show that he created. He obviously has a lot of talent. He really seems like someone who has a weird amount of intelligence, but absolutely no common sense. It's no secret that Ron despises anything and everything, even slightly involving the government. So that kind of begs the question of why would Ron, despite everything that we know about his feelings on the government as a whole, work for said government? Well, for this one, there's actually a couple different theories. The most simple and most likely is that he's just there as a form of obstruction. Simply put, Ron's dislike and distrust of the government led him to one single conclusion. The best and easiest way to hamper the government is to work for the government and do basically nothing. With his worldview, it made perfect sense that he would believe that he could do a borderline incompetent job working for the government and no one would care. I guess he was right. He was put in charge of an entire department, and even to that end, he was routinely going out of his way to avoid doing any actual work. The few times we do see him doing something, it's actually kind of outside of his jurisdiction, like when he fixed a pothole outside of Diane's house. So he could just be working there to make the government even slower and more unreliable than it already was. Kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. Or it could be that Ron was looking for a place to hide his gold. As another theory suggests, Ron is using his position to not only hide his gold, but to also keep a watchful eye over it. We find out in the series that Ron has hidden at least part of his fortune under a tree in a park. If he was just some guy doing that, he likely would have been caught or risked his treasure being found. But if Ron is in charge of the entirety of the parks department, not only would no one question why he was digging in the park, but he would personally know if someone was planning to do something like that. It's the perfect cover. And what's kind of interesting about these two is that they can actually still both be true. So we know that Ron is very well off, but this theory suggests that he's not the only one in the parks department with a good bit of money. Leslie Knope, despite being a woman of the people, seems to be living beyond her means. So let's take a look at how much Leslie Knope is force of habit. Anyways, it seems like Leslie has some kind of financial backing that's letting her live her best waffle-filled life. For starters, she works primarily for the government as an assistant director. That would pay somewhere around the $50,000 mark, so keep that salary in the back of your mind. She buys or makes a lot of gifts for people for seemingly random days throughout the year. She's donated money several times throughout the series, even putting down $1,000 to keep rec center classes going. She paid for April's trip to London as well as Ron's to Scotland. And she even runs a huge campaign for city council, like a campaign that's way too big for a position of that size. Granted, she does have some donors, but she's not going to raise the amount of money she would need while running for that kind of position, especially when she's running against Sweetum's money. That might not seem like a lot, especially when we consider that all of these take place throughout the series and aren't immediately following one another. But she also has a pretty sizable house. It's possible that once Leslie and Ben get married that he helps her with her finances and gets everything in order, but we never hear about her being in any kind of debt. So it seems like it might be possible that Leslie does come from some kind of money. I mean, after all, she is technically an Eagletonian. So Parks and Rec isn't incredibly subtle about the terrible things that happened to the Native Americans who were originally living where the city of Pawnee would eventually be. I mean, there's entire murals that pretty blatantly show some of the atrocities that were perpetrated. And this theory puts forward that the city itself is cursed because of the grave injustices performed in the past, that the Wamapoke tribe placed a curse. I mean, we've seen that the police, the majority of the government, and the average citizen all don't seem to care about the city as a whole, and for the vast majority of the series, Pawnee actually seems to be pretty downtrodden. I mean, raccoons have infested the hospitals at least once in the past. That's not something that normally happens. On the other end of things, the Wamapoke people seem to be far more prosperous than the rest of Pawnee. They have a thriving casino, and Ken, the Wamapoke spokesperson, seems to typically get his way, something that we can't say for the vast majority of characters in the series. But what about the fact that by the end of the series, the city itself seems to be prospering again? It absorbed Eagleton, has a national park, and has brought in some major business opportunities. So how does that play into everything? Well, if you'll remember back in Season 3, Episode 7, Harvest Festival, Ken performs a fake ceremony to remove the fake curse on the Harvest Festival. But what if this fake ceremony removed the much more real curse, even if it wasn't supposed to? It might explain why things seem to begin to turn around in the very near future after this episode. If you watched Parks and Rec, you've probably noticed that Chris Traeger has a bit of a habit of calling people by their full name.
Leslie, no! Ron Swanson. Ron Swanson. Don Amigo. Chris Traeger.
And while this seems like just a funny character trait that's become weirdly memeable,
And Perkins.
it may have served a slightly different purpose. So there are a lot of characters in the show. Like, a lot. And while today it's pretty easy to go through and name each and every one of them, when someone is first introduced to the series, it might be hard to keep all of the main characters straight, let alone the background and side characters. This theory is really straightforward. It thinks that one of the main reasons that Chris Traeger was introduced, and he had this quirk, was to help reinforce who all of the characters are for the audience. While you probably already know who Ann was, it's borderline impossible to see Ann Perkins without saying Ann Perkins. So basically just a fun and different way to help keep all of the characters' names straight. So this is something that I've actually talked about on this channel before, and Jim O'Hare actually saw it and reached out to me about before, which was really cool. Hi, if you're watching this, Jim. But the short version of it is that Jerry, Gary, Larry, whatever you want to call him, is actually a deep cover Soviet spy. Let's look at some evidence. For starters, Jerry is an incredibly talented individual. He's an incredible artist, something that would take an insane amount of dexterity and care. But whenever we see him at work or in public, he's absolutely a klutz. It's definitely possible that he's pretending to be clumsy as a cover. I mean, look at what he can do when he's out of the public eye.
Whoa! You almost dropped that, clumsy.
Him being clumsy has people sort of disregarding him and assuming that he's harmless. Speaking of his home life, it absolutely seems like it could be kind of forced. They're so over-the-top close that it almost seems like it could be a parody of a happy family instead of just a happy family. There's also his career in government, even eventually becoming the mayor of Pawnee. It was a relatively common tactic to try and infiltrate the government at the local level. They'd be less likely to get caught, and they'd have a greater capacity to affect the day-to-day lives of the average American. If you want a slightly more detailed version, I'll link my old video down in the description. So frequent viewers of two of the most popular shows of the late 2000s probably noticed that the shows actually share an actress who plays major characters in both series, Rashida Jones. In The Office, she played Karen Filippelli, and in Parks and Rec, she played Ann Perkins. This theory puts forward that not only are these shows in the same universe, but that Ann Perkins actually is Karen Filippelli, that Karen actually went into the Witness Protection Program and is now living as Ann Perkins. This one doesn't have a ton of actual evidence in the series itself, but let's look at some of the ideas behind it. First is that the name Ann Perkins just kind of sounds like a quickly made up generic name. Then there's the question of why Ann Perkins actually lives in Pawnee. She wasn't born there and she really doesn't seem to like it, so why stay? I mean, sure, she was dating Andy for a time, but they do break up and she could absolutely get out if she disliked it that much. Speaking of which, why were those two dating to begin with? They don't really seem to have too much in common, but it could be that she thought Andy was at least somewhat tough, and it might be a good idea to have some extra protection around if she were scared of someone coming knocking. But why would she be in the Witness Protection Program? Well, obviously, she was a key witness in the Scranton Strangler case. Ignore the fact that we see her a few times later in the office while she should be living as Ann Perkins in Pawnee. That's irrelevant. Ice Town costs Ice Clown his town crown, a headline that in the Parks and Rec universe lives in infamy. It's referencing that time that Ben Wyatt managed to get elected mayor of his town when very young, and heavily invested in an ice rink named Ice Town, bankrupt the town, got impeached, and driven out. But the question really comes down to, why? What made Ben invest so heavily in a huge ice rink? Well, later on in the series, in Season 6, Episode 6, Filibuster, we find out that Ben actually has kind of a thing for women in ice skates. In fact, he even says it's a sex fantasy thing. So would it be that huge of a leap of logic to go from a girl in roller skates to a girl in ice skates? I mean, I'd say not. So it really seemed like Ben Wyatt bankrupted an entire town just to get his jollies seeing girls in skates. This is another one of those theories that doesn't really have a ton of evidence backing it up, but is kind of fun to think about. So this theory puts forward that Ron Swanson is actually April Ludgate's father. The two certainly share a bond that seems to go further than the traditional mentor-mentee relationship. In a lot of ways, April is really the only person who seems to have a super deep understanding of Ron and vice versa. I mean, April was the one who figured out where Ron had hidden his gold at one point almost entirely off of instinct. And when April quits the parks department, Ron actually goes to April's house and asks her to come back. She even works as Ron's assistant for a time during the series. April is also one of the few people originally aware of Ron's moonlighting as a jazz saxophonist going by the stage name of Duke Silver. But the only reason she knows about Duke Silver actually being Ron Swanson is because her parents have a lot of Duke Silver's albums. So it certainly might not entirely be out of the realm of possibility that April's mother and Ron had a one-night stand at one point and conceived April as a result, though I don't think it's super likely. Mark is a character that's pretty easy to forget about despite him being a main character and love interest for the show's first 2 seasons. But then he just kind of disappears. Unlike many of the characters who are given proper send-offs when they decide to leave, Mark just kind of vanishes. It's kind of weird, really. But according to yet another theory, Mark hasn't just left the government and gotten a new job, he's actually dead. That Mark actually committed suicide. That's why he's not actively brought up after he's gone. Think about it. Mark left his job, Anne has broken up with him, and he seems to be kind of stuck. He wasn't exactly the most positive character on the show to begin with. That might have something to do with why Leslie waited so long to get together with Ben as well. She was grieving for Mark, as a former lover and as a close friend. And he's never brought back up in the show purely out of respect. It's easy to forget because they kind of get away from the format as the show goes on, but the show was originally written and produced in the same mockumentary style that The Office was. And it would make sense that they wouldn't spend too much time on someone who had committed suicide. And really quick, if you or someone you know is dealing with anything similar, please call the suicide prevention line. I'll leave that number up on the screen here for you. This is another theory that does its best to try and explain the difference between the Jerry we see at work and the one we see in most other aspects of his life. But this time, instead of being merely a sleeper agent, this theory puts forward that Jerry was actually a cult leader. It seems super unlikely, but when you think about it, it actually kind of makes more sense than Jerry being a spy. So we know for a fact that there was a cult in Pawnee back in the 70s, the Reasonableists, Hale Zorp. Granted that we do know that Jerry wasn't the leader the entire time. When the town was briefly taken over by the cult in the 70s, it wasn't Jerry in charge, it was some guy named Lou. But Jerry would have been in his 20s at the time, so it's really not out of the realm of possibility that Jerry would have risen through the ranks of the cult and assumed the mantle of leader after a time. I mean, we know that Jerry was very interested in making connections with powerful people when he was younger. Rising through the ranks of a cult that has legitimate power in town seems like a good way to do that. And to be honest, Jerry seems like the kind of guy who would do well in a cult. Everyone we see who's close to him has a weirdly deep devotion to him. Again, take a look at his family. They're not just close, they're cultishly close. And it's certainly possible that Jerry met Gail through the cult. I mean, that's certainly the second most likely reason they're together. And finally, when Jerry is named mayor temporarily, he ends up winning re-election multiple times in landslide victories. It could certainly be the cult coming out in full support of one of their own and taking back political power in the town. But maybe this time it's just a bit more covert than the previous time. This is one of those theories that I don't think is supposed to be taken super seriously. It basically states that Andy Dwyer had a pretty fun childhood, that Andy Dwyer was actually Andy from Toy Story. Admittedly, this theory is possibly the most flimsy out of any we've talked about so far. So we know that for a while on the show, Andy really wanted to be a cop. After all, his two favorite toys were actually a sheriff and a space ranger. Not to mention how ready to play pretend Andy is at basically any moment. particularly with his persona, Burt Macklin. We also know that Andy is still very childish, which could explain why Toy Story Andy was so reluctant to give up any of his toys at the end of Toy Story 3. And finally, in Toy Story, we see guitars in Andy's room as well as some music posters. And as we all know, Andy very famously lived as the frontman singer/guitarist for rock band Mouse Rat. Case closed. Maybe. This is another kind of off-the-wall theory. So we see Jean-Ralphio's father in the series, played by one Henry Winkler actually. But this theory says that not only is Jean-Ralphio's father not Henry Winkler, but that it's actually Steve Harrington. You know, the guy with the hair from Stranger Things. I mean, surely that hair's hereditary, right? I mean, look at these two. But that's not all the evidence there is. For starters, both shows take place in Indiana. Actually pretty close to one another in theory. We know that Pawnee is about 90 miles from Indianapolis, and in Stranger Things they go to the city and are home in time for dinner. So it's obviously not that far. But despite what we've seen from Jean-Ralphio's family, like his twin sister and supposed father, we don't hear anything about his mother, aside from one line where he talks about his father kicking her out when she turned 30. So maybe Steve got someone pregnant. The original theory speculated Nancy, but that seems much less likely now, and his older brother who was away at medical school came back and took the babies off Steve's hands. And to try to make up for their actual father not being there, he spoiled the ever-loving hell out of these kids, resulting in the glorious train wrecks that we see throughout the series. Not to mention how similar the two seem like they are. A love of breaking into songs and a general goofiness. It's certainly not the most unbelievable theory of the bunch. And that's where we'll end the video for now. If you like this video, comment down below if you'd like to see me do more content like it in the future. Follow me on Twitter at 10kbill to stay up to date on everything I'm working on. Support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.